July 20th, 1969, the entire world holds its breath as Neil Armstrong descends the ladder of the lunar module Eagle and touches the surface of the moon. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. As millions watch this historic moment on television, few know that the man behind the rocket that made it all possible carried a past that still divides opinions today. This is the man who built the vengeance weapons that rained down on London during World War II. The same man who would become the architect of America's space dreams. His name was Wernher von Braun, and this is his extraordinary and controversial story. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this content about military history and space exploration, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us tremendously to continue bringing fascinating stories like this one. And leave in the comments, do you believe von Braun's past should have prevented his participation in the American space program? To understand how an aristocratic German boy became the most important figure of the space age, we need to go back to March 23, 1912, in the small town of Würsitz, then part of the German Empire and today Polish territory. Werner Magnus Maximilian Freiherr von Braun was born into a noble Prussian family. His father, Baron Magnus von Braun, was an influential banker who would later become Minister of Agriculture in the Weimar Republic. His mother, Emmy von Quistorp, descended from medieval royalty and possessed a refined education, playing piano and encouraging the intellectual interests of her three sons. Young Werner didn't show much interest in traditional studies. In fact, he had considerable difficulties with physics and mathematics during his early school years. But everything changed when his mother gave him a special gift at his confirmation in the Lutheran Church: a telescope. This simple instrument planted in his young heart a seed of curiosity about the cosmos that would never leave him. In 1920, when Werner was only 8 years old, his family moved to Berlin, the political heart of Germany. It was there in 1925, at the age of 13, that the event occurred that would define his entire life. Werner acquired a copy of the book Die Rakete zu den Planetenräumen, or The Rocket into Interplanetary Space, written by rocket pioneer Hermann Oberth. The boy was fascinated by the illustrations of spacecraft and rockets, but he encountered a frustrating barrier. He couldn't understand the complex mathematical equations that filled the pages. This frustration became his fuel. Werner decided that if he wanted to understand rockets, he needed to master mathematics and physics. Suddenly, the mediocre student transformed. He began to obsessively study calculus and trigonometry, not because a teacher told him to, but because he wanted to decipher the secrets of spaceflight. In a short time, he was leading his class in exact sciences. This self-directed determination would be a defining characteristic of von Braun for the rest of his life. In 1929, at only 17 years old, Werner joined the German Society for Space Travel, known by the initials VFR. There he finally met his hero, Hermann Oberth, and began assisting him in practical experiments with liquid fuel rocket engines. The Society members conducted their tests at an abandoned ammunition depot on the outskirts of Berlin. These were dangerous and primitive experiments, but they represented the first practical steps toward spaceflight. Von Braun was charismatic, eloquent, and possessed a remarkable ability to explain complex technical concepts in an understandable way. These qualities caught the attention not only of his fellow rocket enthusiasts, but also of much more powerful people. In 1932, while still enrolled at the Berlin Institute of Technology, von Braun received a visit that would change everything. The German army, impressed with the Society's rocket experiments, offered him a job developing liquid fuel missiles. For the 20-year-old, the choice was pragmatic. The Army had money, facilities, and resources that amateurs could never dream of. And von Braun had a singular goal: to build large and powerful rockets capable of reaching space. If the path to achieving that dream went through developing military weapons, he was willing to walk it. In October 1932, Werner von Braun began working for the German Imperial Army at the Kummersdorf rocket station south of Berlin. He was appointed the program's chief civilian specialist. Working under Captain, later General, Walter Dornberger, von Braun dove headfirst into military rocket development. His doctoral thesis, completed in 1934 at the University of Berlin, dealt with the combustion of liquid rocket engines and was immediately classified as military secret. At 22, he was a doctor of physics and was already on the path to becoming Germany's leading rocket expert. But the world was changing around him in sinister ways. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party seized power in Germany. Initially, von Braun seemed to have little interest in politics. He was a conservative nationalist by family upbringing, but his letters and diaries from the time show that his true passion was exclusively rocket technology. However, in a totalitarian state, political neutrality was impossible. In 1933 and 34, von Braun became a member of an SS riding unit, the elite paramilitary forces of the Nazi Party. He would later claim that this was common among students at the time, pressured to participate in paramilitary organizations. In 1937, now 25 years old and already technical director of the rocket program, von Braun received a letter asking him to join the Nazi Party. He waited a few months, but eventually joined in May 1937. In his own words, decades later, membership required little commitment, and refusing it could harm his career. Meanwhile, the rocket program was growing exponentially. By 1936, the facilities at Kummersdorf had become inadequate for the ambitious projects von Braun and his team envisioned. They needed a remote location away from prying eyes where they could test increasingly larger rockets. Von Braun helped choose the site, Peenemünde, a remote area on the Baltic Sea coast. The Nazi government, increasingly focused on rearmament, invested heavily in building a vast research and development complex there. At Peenemünde, at 25 years old, Werner von Braun became the technical director of one of Nazi Germany's most advanced and secret projects. Hundreds of engineers, technicians, and scientists worked under his leadership. The goal was to develop a revolutionary rocket capable of carrying an explosive warhead to unprecedented distances. Initially, the project was called Aggregate 4, or A4. Later, it would be renamed with a name that would enter history, V2, Hitler's second vengeance weapon. The development of the V2 was marked by repeated failures and gradual successes. Von Braun demonstrated an exceptional ability to manage large and complex teams, keeping morale high even after catastrophic test explosions. He had a philosophy he would repeat throughout his career. Failure was an essential part of learning. Each rocket that exploded on the launch pad provided valuable data about what not to do. In October 1942, after countless failures, the V2 finally had its first successful flight. The rocket reached an altitude of over 80 kilometers, technically crossing the boundary of space and becoming the first man-made object to do so. For von Braun and his team, it was a moment of triumph. Dornberger reportedly said, "Today, the space rocket was born." But this technological triumph was inextricably linked to the military objectives of the Nazi regime. It was at this point that von Braun's story becomes truly controversial and morally complex. In 1940, von Braun received a visit from an SS colonel named Müller. The visitor brought an invitation, or rather, an order disguised as an invitation from Heinrich Himmler, the supreme leader of the SS. Himmler wanted von Braun to join the SS as an officer. Von Braun subsequently claimed that he consulted his military superior, Dornberger, who explained that the SS was trying to increase its influence over the rocket program. Reluctantly, von Braun accepted, starting as Untersturmführer, equivalent to second lieutenant. In the following years, he would receive regular promotions by mail, according to his own statements, reaching the rank of Sturmbannführer or major in June 1943. There are controversies about how actively von Braun participated in the SS. He later claimed to have worn the uniform only once, but in 2002, a former SS officer at Peenemünde told the BBC that von Braun regularly wore the uniform at official meetings. The truth probably lies somewhere between these narratives. What is indisputable is that von Braun was a member of both the Nazi Party and the SS during the darkest period in German history. As the war intensified and Germany's fortunes declined, Hitler ordered mass production of the Vol II. The problem was where to get labor when the Eastern Front consumed all available human resources. The Nazi solution, as in many other areas of the war economy, was the brutal exploitation of foreign workers and prisoners. A new underground production facility was built at Mittelwerk near Nordhausen in central Germany. The labor came from the attached concentration camp, Mittelbau Dora. The conditions at Mittelwerk were hellish. Prisoners worked to exhaustion, digging tunnels in the mountains and assembling V-2 rockets in underground conditions without proper ventilation, with little food and subject to brutal punishments. Thousands lost their lives due to the horrible conditions. Historical estimates suggest that more people perished building the V-2s than were victims of the missiles themselves when used against Allied targets. The question that haunts von Braun's legacy to this day is, how much did he know? Historical documents show that von Braun visited the Mittelwerk facilities about 15 times between late 1943 and February 1945. These visits, usually lasting one day, were intended to communicate changes in V-2 design and final acceptance criteria resulting from continued testing at Peenemünde. He testified in 1969 that he was aware of the camp conditions, but stated that he had no authority over production and that protests would be useless and dangerous under a totalitarian regime. Critics argue that von Braun chose to ignore the horrors to continue his work with rockets, his blinding passion. Defenders point out that he operated under a brutal regime where questioning orders could result in fatal consequences. The truth, as often happens in history, is probably more nuanced than any simple narrative would allow. In September 1944, the first V-2 missiles were launched against Allied targets. London was the primary target, but Antwerp and other cities were also hit. The rockets traveled faster than sound, arriving without warning. Unlike bombers, against which there were defenses, there was no way to intercept a V-2. More than 3,000 were launched until the end of the war, causing thousands of casualties. But by 1944, it was clear to any informed observer that Germany was losing the war. Von Braun was certainly among the informed observers. In March 1944, a bizarre episode occurred that further complicates his narrative. Von Braun was arrested by the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, on charges of defeatism and expressing greater interest in spaceflight than in weapons. According to reports, someone had denounced him for saying at a party that his true goal was space exploration, not military missiles. Himmler ordered his arrest, and von Braun was held in custody for 2 weeks. Only the intervention of Dornberger and the recognition that von Braun was indispensable to the V-2 program led Hitler to order his release. This episode is often cited by those who argue that von Braun was primarily a passionate scientist forced by circumstances to serve military ends. However, critics note that this doesn't absolve him of his earlier choices or his knowledge about forced labor conditions. As 1945 began, the Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces advanced from the east and the Western Allies from the west. Von Braun began planning for the post-war period. He gathered his core team and discussed which side would be better to surrender to. The choice was clear. The Soviets had a reputation for treating German prisoners with extreme harshness, especially after the atrocities committed by the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. The Americans, they hoped, would be more lenient and potentially interested in their rocket expertise. In April 1945, as orders arrived to destroy all facilities and documentation, von Braun made a risky decision. He ordered that all detailed technical documentation about the V-2 and related projects be hidden in an abandoned mine in the Harz Mountains. Then von Braun and about 500 members of his team began a risky escape south through Germany, toward the advancing American lines, always one step ahead of SS forces that had orders to eliminate them to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. On May 2, 1945, von Braun's brother, Magnus, who was also a rocket engineer, found an American soldier from the 44th Infantry Division. In broken English, Magnus said, "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender." Thus, almost prosaically, one of the brightest minds in rocket technology passed from service to Nazi Germany to what would become a career in the United States. The American military was ecstatic. They had captured not only the detailed plans of the world's most advanced rockets, but also the genius behind them and most of his team. The Soviets, arriving at Peenemünde a few days later, found only empty facilities and a few second-tier engineers. The race for German rocket technology had been won by the Americans. Initially, von Braun and about 120 of his key engineers were taken to Fort Bliss, Texas, as part of a secret operation called Operation Overcast, which was later renamed Operation Paperclip. The name Paperclip came from the practice of attaching paperclips to the dossiers of German scientists whose Nazi pasts were being revised to make them acceptable for entry into the United States. Officially, American policy prohibited the immigration of Nazi Party and SS members, but the Cold War was already beginning, and competition with the Soviet Union for technological supremacy was considered more important than ideological purism. Between 1945 and 1950, von Braun and his team worked at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, helping the American Army understand and use the captured V-2 rockets. More than 60 V-2 rockets were launched at White Sands for research purposes. Von Braun used this period to study English, adapt to American culture, and subtly rebuild his public image, from Nazi engineer to visionary space scientist. In 1950, von Braun's team was transferred to the Redstone Arsenal near Huntsville, Alabama, a small southern town that would become synonymous with the American space program. There, they began developing America's first medium-range ballistic missile, the Redstone. This rocket, capable of carrying a nuclear warhead about 200 miles, became the initial backbone of the United States' nuclear deterrent force. The development of the Redstone was not without challenges. Launch pad explosions were common. On one occasion, after a particularly spectacular explosion at Cape Canaveral, General Holger Toftoy, von Braun's superior, asked why the rocket had exploded. Von Braun replied that they would need to analyze the data. When pressed if he had any idea, von Braun reportedly responded with frustration, "Yes, it exploded because the darn thing blew up." This incident illustrates both the pressure under which the team worked and von Braun's philosophy about failure and learning. While working for the Army, von Braun began carefully cultivating his public image as a space visionary. He was charismatic, photogenic, and had a German accent that Americans found charming rather than threatening. In 1952, he published a series of articles in Collier's magazine about how humanity could establish a space station and travel to Mars. The elaborate illustrations and bold concepts captured the American public's imagination, but it was his partnership with Walt Disney that truly transformed him into a celebrity. In 1955, von Braun appeared in 3 Disney television programs about space travel. Man in Space, Man and the Moon, and Mars and Beyond. Yes, using detailed models and animations, von Braun explained complex concepts in ways anyone could understand. About 40 million Americans watched these programs. Suddenly, the former SS officer was the friendly face of America's space future. Some critics called it image laundering, but it was undeniably effective. In 1955, von Braun and his German team colleagues became naturalized American citizens. At a ceremony at Huntsville High School, von Braun swore allegiance to his new homeland. For him, it wasn't just a legal formality, it represented a new identity. He enthusiastically embraced American culture, becoming an active member of the local Lutheran church and getting involved in the Huntsville community. But the real transformation in von Braun's career came with the beginning of the space race. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, Earth's first artificial satellite. The spherical device, weighing 183 pounds, orbited Earth emitting radio signals that anyone with a simple receiver could pick up. The psychological impact on the United States was profound. If the Soviets could put a satellite in space, they could also put a nuclear warhead anywhere in America. The launch of Sputnik created what became known as the Sputnik crisis in the United States. Suddenly, there was a national feeling that America was falling behind in science and technology. The Navy's rocket program, called Vanguard, tried to respond quickly, but in December 1957, the Vanguard rocket exploded spectacularly on the launch pad just seconds after ignition. The press cruelly dubbed it Kaputnik and Flopnik. Desperate, the American government finally turned to von Braun and his team. Using a modified version of the Redstone rocket called Jupiter-C, von Braun promised he could put an American satellite into orbit in 90 days. On January 31, 1958, exactly on schedule, von Braun's rocket successfully launched Explorer 1, America's first satellite. The entire country sighed in relief. Von Braun was on the cover of Time magazine, his calm European expression superimposed over the flames of a missile launch. The headline proclaimed, "Missile Man von Braun." In July 1958, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the law creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, but initially von Braun and his team remained with the Army, working at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. They developed larger missiles, the Jupiter and Pershing, both capable of carrying nuclear warheads at intercontinental distances. However, von Braun's true passion was increasingly in civilian space exploration, not military missiles. In May 1961, President John F. Kennedy made a bold announcement before Congress. The United States should commit to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. It was an almost impossible goal. No existing rocket had remotely the power necessary for such a mission. On July 1, 1960, von Braun and his team were formally transferred from the Army to NASA. Von Braun became the first director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. His mandate was clear: develop the giant rocket that could take Americans to the moon. That rocket would be the Saturn V. The Saturn V wasn't just big, it was colossal. At 363 feet tall, it was taller than a 36-story building and 60 feet taller than the Statue of Liberty. Fully fueled, it weighed 6.2 million pounds, the weight of about 400 elephants. When its 5 F-1 first-stage engines fired, they generated 34.5 million newtons of thrust, creating more power than 85 Hoover dams. The development of the Saturn V was one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. The rocket had more than 3 million individual parts, and all needed to work perfectly in sync. Von Braun led a team of thousands of engineers and technicians. He was an exceptional manager, known for his ability to keep teams motivated and focused on common goals, even under immense pressure. Von Braun insisted on an approach called all-up testing, testing all components together instead of testing each stage separately. This was a risky philosophy, but it saved precious time. George Miller, head of the Office of Manned Space Flight, calculated that at the rate the program was progressing with gradual testing, it would be impossible to land a man on the moon before 1970. Von Braun's approach significantly shortened the timeline. The first test of the complete Saturn V was the launch of Apollo 4 on November 9, 1967. It was a total success. In the following years, each Saturn V launched worked perfectly. This is remarkable in rocket history. The Saturn V's 100% success rate remains unmatched to this day. Von Braun was deeply involved not only in technical design, but also in ensuring that each launch was as safe as possible for the astronauts. After the tragic Apollo 1 fire in January 1967, which took the lives of 3 astronauts during a ground test, von Braun intensified safety protocols even further. He viscerally understood that failure would not be measured only in terms of destroyed hardware, but in lost human lives. In December 1968, a Saturn V launched Apollo 8, the first crewed mission to orbit the moon. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders became the first humans to see the far side of the moon and witness Earth rising over the lunar horizon. It was a moment of transcendent beauty that helped redefine how humanity viewed itself in the cosmos, but the supreme goal was still to come. On July 16, 1969, von Braun was at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, watching as his Saturn V majestically lifted from the launch pad, carrying Apollo 11 and its 3 crew members, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. As the flames from the 5 F-1 engines roared, consuming 13 tons of fuel per second, von Braun must have felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was the culmination of decades of work, the realization of the dream he had nurtured since that day in 1925 when he first read Oberth's book. 4 days later, on July 20th, as the world watched, Neil Armstrong descended the ladder of the lunar module Eagle and became the first human to step onto the moon's surface. Armstrong's words echoed across the planet. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. At Mission Control in Houston and in viewing rooms across the country, people wept with joy. America had won the space race. For von Braun, it was the apex of an extraordinary journey. The boy who dreamed of space travel, the engineer who built vengeance weapons for a totalitarian regime, the immigrant who reinvented himself as the chief architect of the American space program, had finally achieved the impossible goal. The Saturn V worked perfectly. The astronauts landed safely, conducted their activities on the lunar surface, and returned to Earth without problems. But even in this moment of triumph, shadows from von Braun's past weren't completely absent. 6 weeks before the Apollo 11 launch in November 1968, a West German court asked von Braun to testify in the trial of 3 former SS men from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, which had supplied forced labor for V-2 production. Von Braun, now director of the center that managed the gigantic Saturn V moon rocket, feared the associated publicity might damage his reputation and NASA's. He testified, but his statement was carefully crafted. He denied personal responsibility and put as much distance as possible between his rocket development center at Peenemünde and the Mittelwerk complex where production occurred. In a press interview after the testimony, he presented the narrative he would maintain for the rest of his life. He was an apolitical scientist who only wanted to go to space, built missiles because it was his national duty in wartime, and was only nominally associated with the Nazi Party and SS because refusing would be harmful to his career in a totalitarian society. This narrative was largely accepted by the American public at the time. Most people didn't want to examine too closely the past of their space hero. The Cold War was still in full swing, and von Braun was seen as a crucial asset in competition with the Soviet Union. His former employer, the U.S. Army, and now NASA, had effectively neutralized most uncomfortable questions about his earlier service to Adolf Hitler. After Apollo 11, von Braun continued overseeing subsequent lunar missions. Saturn V rockets launched Apollos 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17, all resulting in successful lunar landings. Apollo 13, which suffered a critical failure during the journey to the Moon, was launched without problems by the Saturn V. The problem was with the Apollo spacecraft, not the rocket. The crew survived thanks to the ingenuity of flight controllers and the astronauts themselves, but the incident highlighted the inherent dangers of space exploration. In March 1970, von Braun was transferred from leadership of the Marshall Space Flight Center to NASA headquarters in Washington, becoming Deputy Associate Administrator for Planning. It was a promotion in title, but von Braun soon discovered he preferred the hands-on work of engineering and project management to the political games and bureaucracy of headquarters. Moreover, NASA's budget was being drastically cut. Congress and the American public, having conquered the Moon, were losing their appetite for ambitious space spending, while the Vietnam War drained resources and national attention. Von Braun had envisioned a future where Apollo's achievements would be just the beginning: permanent space stations, crewed missions to Mars, lunar bases. He wrote articles and popular books about these concepts, always promoting an optimistic vision of humanity's future in space. But the political reality was that the moment had passed. In June 1972, after seeing his budgets and future projects repeatedly cut, von Braun retired from NASA. He accepted a position as vice president of Fairchild Industries, an aerospace company in Maryland. There he continued to work on space-related issues and also became involved in founding the National Space Institute in 1975, an organization intended to promote education and public interest in space exploration. But von Braun's time was running out. He was diagnosed with kidney cancer in 1973. Despite treatment, the cancer spread. Wernher von Braun passed away on June 16, 1977, at 65 years old, in Alexandria, Virginia. He was buried at Ivy Hill Cemetery in Alexandria. His wife, Maria, whom he had married in 1947, and their 3 children survived him. So, how should we judge the legacy of Wernher von Braun? This is a question that historians, ethicists, and the general public still debate decades after his passing. On one hand, he was arguably one of the greatest rocket engineers in history. His technical vision, leadership skills, and relentless determination made both the V-2 and the Saturn V possible. Without von Braun, it's debatable whether the Americans would have landed on the Moon when they did, if at all. He was also a masterful communicator who helped inspire generations of young people to pursue careers in science and engineering. His writings and public appearances transformed spaceflight from science fiction into tangible possibility in the public mind. Many of the scientists and engineers who worked in the space program in subsequent decades cited von Braun as their inspiration. On the other hand, it's impossible to forget that von Braun was a member of the Nazi Party and the SS, and that he had knowledge of the inhumane conditions under which the V-2s were manufactured. Thousands of prisoners lost their lives in those facilities. Von Braun visited these sites repeatedly, so his claim that he was completely oblivious to the human suffering occurring there is implausible. At minimum, he chose to prioritize his rocket work over the welfare of the human beings exploited to build them. Some argue that von Braun was primarily a victim of circumstances, a scientist trying to survive under a brutal totalitarian regime. Others see him as a moral opportunist, willing to serve any master who would provide him the resources to build rockets. There are elements of truth in both perspectives. What further complicates judgment is the context of the Cold War. Operation Paperclip, which brought von Braun and many other German scientists and engineers to the United States, was justified on the basis of strategic necessity. American policymakers argued that if they didn't capture this expertise, the Soviets would. And in the apocalyptic competition between nuclear superpowers, having the best rocket scientists could mean the difference between victory and defeat, or even survival and annihilation. This Cold War logic meant that questions about von Braun's past were systematically minimized or ignored by American authorities. His Nazi records were sanitized to allow his entry into the United States. Uncomfortable questions from the press were discouraged. Von Braun was given a platform to rewrite his own history as that of an apolitical dreamer who only wanted to reach the stars. But does the end justify the means? Do the inspiring space achievements that von Braun made possible compensate for his participation in a genocidal regime and his willingness to exploit forced labor? There are no easy answers to these questions. Different people with different values and ethical priorities will arrive at different conclusions. What we can say with certainty is that Wernher von Braun was a deeply complex and contradictory figure. He was simultaneously a brilliant visionary and a moral opportunist, a technical genius, and a man who made morally questionable choices. He helped usher in the space age, but left in his wake questions about responsibility, justice, and the price of technological progress. His story also raises broader questions about how societies deal with inconvenient pasts. The America of the 40s and 50s was willing to forgive von Braun's Nazi past because he was useful. It was only decades later, when the generation that fought World War II began to dwindle and new generations questioned established narratives, that critically examining his legacy became more common. Today, when we visit space museums and see the magnificent Saturn V rockets on display, we should remember that they are monuments not only to human triumph, but also to moral complexity. They represent what humanity can achieve when it mobilizes resources and talent toward a common goal, but they also remind us that technological progress cannot be separated from the ethical choices of those who create it. The story of Wernher von Braun teaches us that heroes are rarely pure and villains are rarely one-dimensional. The same hands that signed SS documents also drew the plans for the rocket that took humanity to the moon. The same mind that contemplated the stars also visited facilities where human beings were treated as disposable tools. If you find this story as fascinating and thought-provoking as I do, leave your opinion in the comments. Should von Braun be remembered primarily as the man who took humanity to the moon, or as a scientist who compromised his ethics to pursue his passion? And more broadly, how should we balance individuals' technical achievements with their moral failures? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth stories about complex historical figures from World War II and the space age. Perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from the life of Wernher von Braun is not a definitive judgment about the man himself, but an awareness that we must always question the simple and comfortable narratives we build around historical figures. History is rarely black and white. It's almost always shades of gray. Von Braun died believing he had given humanity the tools for a glorious future among the stars. He was right, in a sense. The Saturn V and the programs it inspired opened the door to the entire era of space exploration that continues to this day. But he also left unresolved questions about responsibility, justice, and what we're willing to overlook in the name of progress. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon that July day in 1969, it represented a giant leap for mankind. But the journey that led to that moment was built on the shoulders of thousands of people, including those who suffered and lost their lives in the underground factories of Nazi Germany. It's a reminder that even our greatest triumphs can have hidden costs and that we must always remain vigilant about the ethical choices we make in pursuit of our goals. The life of Wernher von Braun, from an aristocratic German boy fascinated by the stars, through his controversial career under the Nazi regime, to his reinvention as the architect of the American space program is a story about ambition, talent, moral compromise, and the complexities of human nature. It's a story that has no simple ending or easy morale, and perhaps that's exactly why it continues to fascinate and challenge us, decades after his passing. As we look to the stars and dream of space futures, we must remember where we came from and the choices we made along the way. Von Braun's legacy is both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that technological progress must always be guided by ethical considerations, and that the ends, no matter how glorious, cannot always justify the means. This was the story of how a former SS officer built the rocket that put Americans on the moon. A story of genius and compromised morality, of dreams realized and questions that remain unanswered. A story, in the end, about the complexity of what it means to be human in a world where greatness and failure often walk hand in hand.